everybody. How you doing? Are you enjoying the boot camp? These aren't the kind of boot camps I'm used to, man, but you know. But it's great to see everybody. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'm hoping that maybe our discussion can place some of the other lectures, discussions you've had in a little bit of a broader context. And I think that what you might be able to do this week while you're here is develop your own kind of theory of strategic competence. What does it mean to be competent in terms of the development of policy and strategy? So I'll offer just a few remarks up front, and then I'm really looking forward to where you'd like to take the discussion. And the reason I'm using the word empathy in strategy is because it's very important to be able to view complex challenges and opportunities from the perspective of others. And I borrowed this term, strategic empathy, from Zachary Shore, a great historian, and I'll reference a couple of his books here, and we can talk about that. But of course, this is going to outsmart me because I never use PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. So, okay, hey, hashtag predictable for, washed up general. You got to quote Clausewitz, you know what I mean? So, I mean, it's just compulsory. But Clausewitz would have been fun to have in your boot camp. He went to war at the age of 14, so he was a great from a theoretical perspective about war and a philosopher of war, but he was also a practitioner. And I think this is an element of strategic competence, is you really need people with some practical experience as well. So as you embark on your careers, look for those opportunities to be an implementer of policy before you maybe rush into policy development, for example. And this is what he said about military theory. He said, the theory is not to accompany you to the battlefield and solve problems for you in combat, but your theory helps inform your perspective, right? Just like a good professor isn't with you the rest of his or her life, but they've given you perspective and can help you make decisions and be an effective leader. So think about how you're educating your mind, how you're developing your own theory of strategic competence. And these are questions you might want to keep in mind this week, right? I mean, what is your understanding of strategy? What is its meaning? What are the essential elements of an effective strategy? And can you think of examples that you've seen in your life or in your study of history of successes and failures? What made a particular strategy effective or ineffective? And I think that it's important to define strategy, right? The historian Hugh Strachan has said that the word strategy has become so overused, right, that it's almost devoid of meaning. It's almost banal, right? And of course, that's a problem in terms of our understanding, but it can also be a problem in terms of our strategic competence. And of course, Clausewitz had his definition. You see the Army War College definition, but I like the Richard Betts definition, especially as it applies to war, because it also implies that strategy has an ethical dimension to it, right? And what Betts is stressing is that strategy you ought to be able to use that strategy to explain why war, in particular, is worth the cost and worth the risk. So what are some of the problems when we lack strategic competence? And I'll just go through some of these. These are pitfalls, right? This is what I think history can help us do. It's not going to give us the answer, but history can obviously help us avoid mistakes of the past and maybe ask the right questions. And I think when we get into trouble, as Americans in particular, because I think we're culturally predisposed toward change, right, and technological change in particular, is we neglect continuities that because we don't consider them, create fundamental flaws in our strategies and in our policies. And what this quotation is from a historian named Carl Becker and a speech he gave in 1933 to the American Historical Association. And he essentially said that memory of past and anticipation of future should walk hand in hand in a happy way. So let me just give you an example of this. And I think an example of this is really in the post-Cold War period in the 1990s, when we made some assumptions about the future that were neglectful of continuities in history. And what were some of those assumptions as the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the Cold War? Well, one of them was that an arc of history had sort of guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Related to that assumption was the belief that great power competition was a relic of the past. And then finally, I think we had this belief that our prowess, our technological military prowess would guarantee our security well into the future. There was this orthodoxy that emerged in the military in this period of time in the 90s called the Revolution in Military Affairs. How many people have heard that term before, or RMA? And this was the assumption that, hey, our technological advantages, right, surveillance capabilities, precision strike capabilities, assured communications, access to space assets, all of that would make the next war fast, cheap, and efficient, if war happened at all, if anybody even had the temerity to challenge the United States. And of course, we know that those were unrealistic assumptions. I think in the 1990s, you could say that if we were to use the Icarus analogy, we were flying too high. The second, I think, pitfall and strategy is, of course, hashtag predictable, again, for an historian to say, hey, don't neglect history. But I think that many people question the utility of history, including historians. And therefore, we don't learn lessons that are readily available to us from previous experience. I mean, just think about how arrogant it is, for us to say, hey, all I really need to know is my own experience, right? I don't need to learn from the experiences of others. So I think history is actually an exercise in humility. And the example I would give for the ignorance of history is that I think that over-optimism of the 90s was a setup. That focus on continuity, or change over continuity, was a setup for the difficulties that we encountered in the 2000s, especially in the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I think at a very high level of generality, what history should have instructed us is that, hey, the consolidation of military gains at the end of a campaign to get to a sustainable political outcome, that's never been like an optional phase in war. Right? I mean, there are military operations that are raids, right, which are military operations of short duration, limited purpose, and planned withdrawal. But if you're going to war in Afghanistan and your objective is to ensure that Afghanistan can never again be used as a safe haven or support base for terrorists who are a threat to us and all humanity, that's going to require a political outcome in Afghanistan that is anti-jihadist terrorist, that is anti-Taliban. And I think paradoxically, sadly, in both wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, our short-term approach to what was a long-term problem set in both places actually lengthened those wars and made them more costly. So I think this is the second pitfall that I wanted to highlight is the neglect of history. But also, we can abuse history, right? You can go shopping around in history, right, to find the example you want to justify your preferred policy. And this is what Margaret Macmillan is warning about here in her great book, Dangerous Games. And I think an example of that is the 1991 Gulf War, right? We defeated quite quickly and with a lopsided victory over the fourth largest army in the world. And we learned, I think, a lot of the wrong lessons from that, right? This is kind of what jump-started this orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs. And we thought that, hey, future wars will be fast, cheap, and efficient. But what we neglected is we neglected a couple of really important things. First of all, our objective in the 1991 Gulf War was narrowly circumscribed, a very narrow political objective. Hey, give Kuwait back to the Kuwaitis. Our objective in 2003 in Iraq was much more ambitious, right? Replace the Ba'athist regime, replace Saddam Hussein with a new political order. And so it's important. It's important to recognize the uniqueness of historical cases as you're applying history to understand better contemporary challenges. We often still want to debate, I think, should we have done it being the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I think we should debate who the heck thought it would be easy, right? And why did they think it would be easy. And of course, the lesson we forgot as well is that there are two ways fundamentally to fight, asymmetrically and stupidly. And in 1991, Saddam Hussein picked stupidly, right? But I think our future adversaries learned vicariously from the example of that lopsided victory in 1991. And then I think what's immensely important in terms of strategic competence is to challenge assumptions. I think in the strategies that you look at that are most fundamentally flawed, whether it's from the Vietnam War to the initial strategies or the ever-changing strategies in Afghanistan, which was not a 20-year war, it was a one-year war fought 20 times over with inconsistent and fundamentally flawed strategies, is that these flawed strategies have implicit assumptions that cause fatal flaws. Right, so hey, Pakistan. If we support Pakistan and we have sustained economic and military support, they'll change their ways, right? They'll reduce their support for the Taliban and other jihadist terrorist organizations. How did that work out? The other assumption was that the Taliban, for example, would change, right? They would change because we're negotiating with them and we'll make some concessions with them. They're really just a misunderstood kind of rural movement Of course, they're a transnational terrorist organization that drew support from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, as well as Pakistan's ISI. And they weren't going to change, as we see in Afghanistan today. They weren't going to share power. They weren't going to recognize women's rights. And so we deluded ourselves. So it's important to make implicit assumptions explicit. What are the assumptions on which the strategy depends? And are they valid? Of course, if you don't challenge those assumptions, you can fall prey to all sorts of cognitive traps. And this is a great book called The Psychology of Strategy. It's also complementary to Zachary Shore's book, which you'll see coming up here, or if I may have showed it already, called Blunder: Why Smart People Make Bad Decisions. And these are some of the traps you can fall into, and we can talk about examples of this: optimism bias and groupthink. But really, what happens when you have groupthink is you get to sort of a contrived consensus, right? You have this movement towards satisficing behavior, lowest common denominator approaches to policies and strategies, which of course help obscure the risk and the cost. In decisions that led to an American war in Vietnam, many of Lyndon Johnson's advisors came to the conclusion that to protect their influence with the president, what they had to do was to tell the president what he wanted to hear, what Lyndon Johnson wanted to hear. And of course, that begs the question, okay, what good is your advice anyway if you're just going to tell your boss what he wants to hear? So these, I think, are all important aspects of strategic competence and avoiding these pitfalls. And there's a final one here too, which is the risk of inaction. When we teed up the decision for President Trump whether or not to strike after the Assad regime committed the mass murder of hundreds of people, including over 100 children, in March of 2017 with nerve agents. This is one of the things we tried to highlight to him. It's always easier to see the risk of action. It's much harder to see the risk of inaction. And I think you can draw, or of withdrawing, for example. I think you can draw a direct line, for example, to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons and the unenforced red line in 2013, and the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and the building of islands in the South China Sea and weaponizing those islands based on the perception, hey, the United States isn't going to do anything. And then, of course, to deter future use of chemical weapons, it was important, I think, to conduct that strike in 2017. Okay, so I just wanted to throw this up here to talk about really how can you avoid some of these pitfalls. And it's really by applying design thinking to whatever challenge that you're encountering. And to go through these kind of steps, right? To define the problem on its own terms. If you're looking at a conflict, for example, like in Afghanistan or Iraq, what are the drivers of that conflict? Right? What are the emotions and the aspirations and the ideology that are driving and constraining the other? This is an element of strategic empathy. And then you have to identify what are your vital interests. So what? Why do you care about this? What is at stake for you and for others? And then when you view that complex challenge through the lens of those vital interests, then you can craft an overarching goal and more specific objectives. And then the next step that's really important, I think, is to identify those assumptions. What are the assumptions on which the strategy or policy is based? And in particular, assumptions about the degree to which you and like-minded partners have agency or influence over that complex problem. Recognizing that others, right? Others have authorship over the future, especially enemies, adversaries, and rivals. And then, of course, another plug for history to help you ask the right questions and identify opportunities. So let me just give you an assumption, an example here. Before I go on to that, you just talked with Liz Economy. She's brilliant, huh? I'm sure it was a really great session with her, and in March of 2017, this is just to give you an example of how you can maybe approach a complex problem with a higher level of competence. It was important for us to frame a new China policy and strategy. It was kind of an urgent priority because President Trump was about to meet with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago during the first week of April. And so what we did is we collected, what I collected, again, predictable for an historian, previous policies toward China going back to the George H.W. Bush administration. This is after, in the post-Cold War period, and tried to identify what were the implicit assumptions underneath all of these policies and strategies. What did they have in common between these administrations of George H.W. Bush, the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush, and the Obama administration? And what we identified is that the fundamental assumption that we had made is that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would, as it prospered, liberalize its economy, play by the rules, first of all, liberalize its economy, and then also liberalize its form of governance. Well, it was pretty clear, by March of 2017, that wasn't going to happen. And so what we did is we tried to make explicit these assumptions, which really kind of flipped our whole approach to the China policy. And you can get these online if you want, because the Trump administration declassified this framing document, a later version of it, that traces back to March of 2017. I think it was in 2020, February of 2020, they declassified the document. It's called the Indo-Pacific Strategy framing document.